Right. Well, thank you for turning up for this particular event, Africa Week, African Agency and private security. I have to say, when I came up with this idea, and I mentioned it to Ekaette, I wasn't expecting such a big response. To be honest, I thought we might get everyone in her office, actually. But I'm actually very happy to see that we've got a full room here. That the event's going to be an hour and a half. The way we're going to run it is that we have a number of presentations by our African experts on African agency and private security. Now, these are colleagues of mine that are experts on Africa as opposed to private force. So just please bear that in mind. There will be the first sort of 40 minutes will be taken up with these presentations. Then what I want to do is open up the floor to the audience, so you then have an opportunity to actually ask questions of our experts. 2 points that I want to make. One of the reasons why I'm doing this is I've been researching private force now for a quarter of a century. And one of the things that has always come over in my research is that much of what is out there on this topic is what I refer to as Western-centric. It comes from a Western-centric perspective. You know, the African voice is subdued or it's invisible. And that's been the case actually on this topic for many years. And even if you go back to the 60s, you find that is the case. So this to me is an opportunity to open up this discussion, and let's hear what our African colleagues have to say about this topic. And again, this is important to me because, as you know, with what's going on in Africa, North Africa in particular, private force is coming to the fore once more. And it came to the fore a few years ago. The subject went very quiet, and now it's come back to the fore. So it's really to address that deficiency, that gap, and also to address the gap in the literature. It's time that actually, as I would argue, that our African colleagues and those African experts start writing on this particular subject, rather than leaving it to what I see as Anglo-Saxon, middle-aged white men to do it for you. I think I'd much prefer to read stuff from my African colleagues on this, from places like Russi or Washington. I'm going to leave it at that. Now, there's no order of discussion in that sense. So who wants to start of the panelists? Asala?
Yeah,
right. So Asala will start. If you can introduce yourself, a little bit about it, very quickly about your background, and then what you want to get out of this discussion as far as African agency and private force is concerned. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Asala. I am an Algerian, and I'm doing a PhD at Aberystwyth University, focusing on Russian private military companies and what I call exploitation of moral injuries in local African settings. I investigate their activities in North Africa and also the Sahel region. So today, I would like to highlight the logic and the dynamic of the increasing dependency and reliance on Russian PMCs by countries in North Africa and the Sahel region. A dependency that I argue goes beyond countries they operate in. Now, Russian PMCs are giving these countries' leaders a form of agency restoration through immediate security management. The favorism of Russian PMCs extends to include tribes, also historically marginalized groups, as well as ordinary civilians, all driven by the perception that our Russian PMCs represent the remaining avenue for them to reclaim that political agency. Additionally, the civilian inclination toward like PMCs like Wagner Group as a survival strategy underscores their efficient role in providing economic opportunities and also empowering marginalized groups. The relationship between African countries and Russian PMCs defies simple categorization. It's not only a narrative of victimization or a narrative of survival. The portrayal of African states as a passive victim still is limiting, failing to capture their active efforts to navigate and influence their security landscapes. Western perspectives often adopt this narrative without fully appreciating the diversity and resilience within these African societies. There is a prevalent belief by many of African countries about their nation's ability to rebuild and transform their realities. A belief that challenges the passive roles that was assigned to them externally. African engagement with Russian PMCs underscores this point. It is an act of assertiveness that reflects a desire to retake control. However, this engagement also introduces complexities related to the dependency and self-determination over time. We can learn a lot more when we delve into the intricate relationship between the moral, psychological landscapes of the region, current security dilemmas, and the modus operandi of PMCs like the Wagner Group, for instance. First, African agency demands looking beyond the elite's politics and government actions to include civil society, to include communities' aspirations, and individuals seeking self-determination. The PMC's operations are shaped by both governmental decisions and grassroots local experiences. I would further argue that Russian PMC's engagement, for example, in Libya and Mali and across the Sahara is dependent on the depth of local engagements. Second, the shift toward Russian PMCs is not solely driven by search for political pursuits or economic solutions for survival. These PMCs indeed step in to fill in a gap, security gap, and a void left by local governments. Yet their increasing appeal and widespread allure is deeply interwoven with the moral injuries in these regions, moral injuries that stem from an intense feeling of betrayal by previous regimes, by foreign partners, and even by the international community, reflecting a complex set of needs, unmet needs, and most importantly, respect that these African countries did not have from their ex-partners or ex-colonials like powers like France. Third, and here's like the novelty, is that the PMC approach does more than merely adapt to these realities. It actively shapes them. The group's strategic, for example, the Wagner's group's strategic weaponization and exploitation of security tensions and moral injuries in these environments is highly significant. As this exploitation and weaponization shape government decisions and turn local grievances into action. Unlike the victimization narrative, moral injuries does not undermine African agency, but their successful weaponization by PMCs like Wagner might do, highlighting a sophisticated form of influence and modern engagement of private force in Africa. I will stop here and we'll be happy to discuss the topic further. Thank you.
Just a note for the panelists, I will be quite brutal because obviously what we do want is a discussion and I realise time is moving on. Joanna, why don't we have you next? 5 minutes, Joanna. All right. You know how brutal I can be.
Hello, good morning, and sorry for my dodgy connection. I'm actually at another conference on private military contractors in Copenhagen. That's why I'm not there in person. I would like to start by saying that it's quite timely, the discussion that we are having today. I will pick from exactly where Chris started. The fact that we have a quite westernized way of framing the study of the privatization of security, And here I will be extremely careful, because the problem of the labeling, are we talking about mercenaries? Are we talking about private military contractors? Are we talking about private security companies? And in the case of Africa, and again, I have to also to be quite brutal here, and I'm very happy to see many fellow researchers from different African countries. First, Africa is a huge continent. Even when we address regions like the Sahel, we are not talking about something that is homogeneous or completely equal. Inside the Sahel region, where we now have an incredible number of paramilitary organizations operating on the ground. We are not talking about countries that portray themselves exactly the same way in terms of, for example, of democratic governance or in terms of stability or instability. So it's quite difficult, even from a Westernized perspective, to try to find solutions and even to identify the problems when, for example, countries like Ghana have nothing to do with countries like Mali or Burkina Faso with CAR, etc. And it's interesting that the previous speaker was talking about the question of African countries having an agency. And I would start by saying that the work of Russian paramilitary organizations in Africa, they have to do, above all, with the power to say yes or no. Until now, there was this model where international organizations and Western countries would kind of dictate the good formula on security sector reform, the good formula for how to build a strong government. The problem is the good formula, it's never the best formula unless it is the formula of the country. So I would start by saying as well that the major shift that I saw in terms of interactions, political interactions with several different countries between Russia here in this particular aspect and some other countries had to do precisely with that, with a dialogue that put these countries as partners, not as former colonies or countries that do not have the capacity or even the intelligence to do good governance by themselves. And I think this has been shaping the Western speech for quite a long time. When we discussed before this meeting that the African population do not perceive Russia, private military and security companies as a threat, this is true because there is a mix and a mix of factors that are not only linked to economic deprivation or fragility that led to the presence of these paramilitary organizations on the ground. And this intersects many times, for example, with phenomena linked to violent extremist groups' activity on the region, to activities, for example, in the borderlands. We saw that between CAR and Central African Republic and Sudan. And what we see presently, more than the activity and the commercialization of the military activity by itself, it's also a new dynamic of the conflict and the new dynamic of the market that is no longer linked to purely military activities only. And Wagner, in this sense, was the oddity when we look at several different paramilitary and private military organizations that operated on the ground. Wagner brought not only the training and the military operations, but they also brought, for example, a disinformation capacity that had to do, for example, with electoral support, with the manipulation of information. And this is an oddity, or at least if we want to call it a novelty, on the way private military companies are operating on the ground. And another point that is also interesting, that Wagner also brought to light, is this nexus between organized crime and the activity of these paramilitary organizations. I will not say that the nexus between organized crime and their operations, it's always active. On the contrary, I would say that it's activated on demand and within different types of crime. However, I would say that, for example, corruption has been one of the crimes that has been pervasive and present side by side with Wagner operations on the ground. And if they have been successful in several countries, I always like to talk about the failures. And I think that one of the biggest failures that is rarely mentioned was Mozambique. And we still have to understand, if we want to discuss these organizations and to understand if and how they undermine political stability, how they have failed in their purpose, for example, to contain insurgency, in their purpose to contain terrorism, and to understand how the dynamics in Africa are so different and so particular to each country that we cannot apply a one-size-fits-all solution when talking about the activities of these companies. I will stop here.
And Joanna, right. Barney, do you want to proceed?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And then we'll finish with Mike and the general.
Thank you. Good morning and happy to be here. I stand on the existing protocol. I want to say 3 key things. The first is to say that, and I think the 2 previous speakers have mentioned it, the importance of transcending stereotypes when we are talking about either private military companies, private security companies. There is a creeping stereotyping of the conversation, an attempt to Russianize the conversation, an attempt to even now Chinalize the conversation, that it is about private military and private security companies from particular countries that have a problem, that are causing problems in Africa. So it is important that we need to recognize we are dealing with something that is cut crossing, that cut across, different layers, different countries, different entities. The second thing I want to put on the table is the importance of not conflating things. The topic is huge, is wide, is complex, and it's important that when we talk, we should not confuse certain elements. There are different layers of the analysis, different layers of the issue, and even if we are going to talk about regulation, African agencies, and all of that, we should not conflate a number of things. And I'll give an example. We should not conflate private military contractors, the Black Waters of Israel, the Black Arts of Israel, the former, the likes of the former executive outcomes. We should not conflate them with the wider private security sector that delivers civilian security. You go to South Africa, the private security sector is one of the biggest contributors to the GDP, to employment in South Africa. You go to Kenya, you go to Nigeria, you go to Ghana, you go to many African countries, there are private security companies offering services. That is not what we are talking about, or we need to be clear. The category of private security companies or private security entities that we are talking about. There is another layer of it, which also exposes the complexity of the issue. There is a foreign dimension to it. Those that are external to Africa, those from Russia, the Wagner Group, the see that from Turkey, the Black Ops, even the G4S from UK, the Aegis of this world, the Radar from, the Patriot from Russia, and all of this. They are the foreign element of it. Versus there is an African inborn, internal, indigenous component of this that we are talking about. Of course, that would naturally lead us to think of it in relation to those from South Africa. The STEP, the former executive outcomes, and the number of private security entities that operate overseas that are from South Africa. But within that, there's another layer of it, which are private security companies that are state-backed or that have strong links to state, to government, versus those that are non-state-backed. There are also those that are non-state-backed. And if you are looking for examples of those that are non-state-backed, you are going to be looking at a new generation, or at least two generations of young Africans who are born into conflict, who have been socialized into conflict, who to the extent that being a private militia man or militia woman has become a career pathway, has become a social modality in these entities. You go to the DRC, many of the mining sites, you have non-state-backed group of young people who constitute themselves into militias and who offer protection services, who offer private security services to willing buyers of their services. And they even serve across the border. So they are not even constrained to their country. There are reported cases of former child soldiers from Syria who are recruited to take into Sudan, to Libya, and as far back as even as far as Iraq, to serve in Iraq. So we should not forget that these are, there is an indigenous market for this in Africa. Why has this become so? Is also the fact that in the last 20 years of armed conflict in Africa, there has been a steady erosion and ideologization of conflict in Africa, where political ideology, the role of political ideology in conflict is receding. What you see more is armed groups launching rebellion, not necessarily to take over the state, but to create enclaves and entity and preside over those entities in a way that the logic of profiteering from conflict takes the center stage and less of political ideology. All of that feed into this indigenous African dimension of what I'm talking about. Now, the third thing I want to say is there a demand for this? Is there a market for it? Is there a genuine need for this in the African security environment? I would say yes, at this point in time. It is because there is a gap in African security systems, African security architecture. The APSA never, for one, thought or even mentioned anything that had to do with private dimensions of providing security in Africa. As huge and comprehensive as the APSA framework, and even the training and all the guidance documents and even APSA evaluations that have taken place in the last 20 years have said nothing. I've assumed this has no role to play. But the reality that Africa faces, and that is why many countries, many governments are embracing this, is that genuinely there is a gap, there is a need, there is a market, there is a demand for this in Africa. So the key question is, this has come to stay. It is a reality staring Africa in the face. And of course, we can talk about African government looking for short-term solutions, quick fixes, less burdened by rules of accountability, less bureaucracy about this, the fact that this can be done quickly, the contracting process doesn't take much long, and processes of reward or payment and everything are easily sorted. You don't even have to pay cash, you don't even have to find the money to pay, you can pay in kind through other means. Means that this becomes an attractive proposition to many governments as a short-term response to this. And this is coming in the context that many of the regional and continental systems, collective security arrangements in Africa that are meant to respond to some of these very wicked problems, wicked security challenges that many countries face, are not able to. The APSA has, the African Standby Force has not been able to be deployed. Many of the, ECOWAS has been found to be nowhere in the Sahel. So it becomes easy for governments in the Sahel of the Sahelian state to embrace this, because the regional security arrangements that are meant to come to their aid are nowhere to be found. So moving forward, the key question is, what can Africa do? If this is a reality that the continent faces, at this point in time, what can Africa do? How does Africa regulate this? how can Africa mobilize and use this to serve positive ends? How can Africa use this to support collective security arrangements? How can Africa use it to enhance human security? It is a devil that is not going to go away. So it is how can Africa mobilize and use it for more benign purposes. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Right, we're going to move on quickly. We'll do Özlem, and then we'll come back to our other panelists on the webinar. Right, so want to...
Hello everybody, good morning, and thank you, Chris, for convening this panel on a timely and significant topic. And in today's discussion, I would like to focus on the question of who is controlling who in terms of non-Western PMCs, like especially Wagner and Turkish Sadat, in their relationships with their home countries, as well as their relationship with host countries they serve. So if you look at the quick online research, these two companies, Wagner Group and Sadat, mostly covered in the media reports like paramilitary wings of their countries. And this is partly true if you look at their activities promoting and feeding their home countries' foreign policies. But this is also giving some other consequences. We need to define these companies as maybe hybrid military companies. And hybridity here refers to the merging of private and public interest in a way that benefits both PMCs and states by maintaining the position, maintaining the activities of PMCs as separate entities with their own agencies rather than treating them as a fully under state control. If we look at the relationship of Wagner Group, for example, with Russian state, this proves to be true partly. If you look at the mutiny of June in 2023, or if you look at the Sadat's relationship with the country, in some cases, like we see in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh and Syria, Sadat is a good example promoting the Turkish interest in these groups, in these locations. But the ideological point of view of Sadat also separates this company from other companies, especially considering the ideological proclivity of Sadat's founder, Adnan Tanrıverdi, who aimed the company not only be an extension of the foreign policy, but he wants to create a new Islamic world order of their own, with its creation of new sets of institutions, states, and coalition. So, from this point of view, if we look at these companies' activities in the continent of Africa, I agree with the previous speakers. The continent is quite huge, wide, and complex in their relationships formed with private military companies. For example, as Wagner Group is more visible than the Turkish Sadat, we see that in some cases, the Wagner operates with a great degree of autonomy, pursuing its own interests, especially in Mali and Central African Republic. But we also have other cases. This is not the same activities giving the same results like we see in Mozambique case, for example. If you look at the Mozambique case, we see the African voice is more visible to share a relationship with the private military companies. For example, Wagner arrived in Mozambique to serve as a presidential security for the October 2019 election, and their mission was expanded into counterinsurgency operations against the Islamist insurgents in the northern part of country. But what we saw, this relationship between Wagner Group and Mozambique authorities, especially local military authorities, there was a great disagreement when it comes to Wagner Group's promotion of bombing a whole area without giving any without giving any attention if there's some civilian people will be harmed or not. But what we see in this case, Mozambique local authorities just opposed to this operation would be realized, and shortly Wagner Group had to leave the country, and Mozambican authorities decided to collaborate with another military company from a South African private market, which was Dyke Advisory Group. If we look at the Sadat's activities in Africa, we see the same dynamics is also in the field. Yes, if we look at the Libyan case, we see Turkey's military intervention in the country with addition of the engagement of Sadat changed the course of the conflict against the Eastern power camp under the rule of Libyan armed forces. But if we see the other activities of Sadat, and the Libyan case was obviously feeding the Turkish foreign policy in this case. But if we look at the other cases where Sadat was active in Africa, and these are only allegations, I just want to highlight this point. These were only allegations because we don't have an international monitoring organization to just highlight this kind of activities. But there are some reports. We see Sadat's activities not only training or training the military wing of the countries, but also we see how Turkey was transferring some arms and funds to, for example, Boko Haram and Hamas in the Middle East. And these are also giving us another perception. These companies, these private military companies, are not only in aligned with their foreign policy in their home country's foreign policy, for foreign policies, but they are also having their own agencies to gain a great activity in the continent of Africa. And I stop here.
Yeah, excellent. Right, so keep on time. It's important. Maybe we'll go back to our panelists on the webinar. Now, excuse me for this. My pronunciation, I'm sure, will be wrong. Is it Dr. Nadala Lulu? Inna Lulu. Maybe you can. Now, I know, of course, you're still a member of the Nigerian Armed Forces, so I think your perspective will be very interesting to us.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Major General Sadiq Ndalolo, PhD, from African Leadership Center, Dick King's College, London. I'll start by alluding to some of the points that have been made by previous discussants on proliferation of these private military forces in Africa. But in taking the discussion further, I think I would prefer to highlight some reasons why African leaders are embracing these private military forces despite their exploitative tendencies. We're all conversant with the security situation in Africa. Activities of extremist organizations have led to the death of thousands. Millions of others have been displaced. So in the face of this precarious situation, African leaders are doing their best, but on occasions, they approach foreign governments for support. Now, usually, these supports come with conditions which could take time to meet. Some of these conditions are at variance with the dynamics of African society. Now, remember that the threats have already manifested through violent conflict. People are dying, properties worth millions are being destroyed. So waiting to meet the conditions for support could exacerbate the situation. There are occasions where foreign governments provide equipment support to African countries. Now, even when African countries pay for this equipment, they still come with conditionalities with regards to their employability and deployability. Such conditionalities dictate where and what the equipment must be used for. This could be difficult because the threats facing African society, they are complex and constantly evolving. As you deal with them in one area, they manifest elsewhere in different shapes and forms. And you dare not move this equipment to deal with them where they are manifesting, else you'll be accused of abusing human rights. And this brings me to the point of the constant scrutinization of operations of African militaries by international watchdogs of human rights. Their activities limit the ability of African militaries to operate optimally in order to deal with these threats decisively. So, consequent upon these factors, the population tend to lose confidence in the African militaries. And this leads to gradual delegitimization of the government. So in order to retain legitimacy, some African leaders employ the services of private military forces, even knowing full well the unintended consequences that will come with it. And I'm using some African leaders because a lot of African leaders are not predisposed to employing the services of private military companies. African leaders are apprehensive about private military companies because of this perception that they are just reincarnations of mercenaries. African leaders are paranoid about mercenaries because of their antecedents. I mean, there are 54 African countries. Many of them are facing serious security challenges. But I think it's just, I'm not too sure now because but just about 12 have invited or accepted the invitation proposal of private military forces. So this apprehension for private military forces is predicated upon exploitative tendencies and excess and other excesses, which I mean, companies like African Corps, amongst others, are exhibiting presently on the soils of Africa. Now, I understand that the fears of foreign government is predicated upon human rights issues. There may have been cases of oppression, but this should not this should not preclude a robust support that would holistically deal with the security situation. A robust support that will not alienate African leaders and push them to the hands of these private military companies. I think it's pertinent I also mention that there is this general belief that the main reason why African leaders employ the services of private military forces is because of the opportunity for plausible deniability without fear of vicarious liability. This is unfounded. In my opinion, the main reason is to calm the crisis situation down so as to create enabling environment for entrenching sustainable peace. I would want to conclude by stating that in crisis situation, time is of essence. African leaders cannot afford to be going back and forth with lengthy negotiations. And this is why they seize the initiative and employ these private military companies, even when we know that we cannot account for their operations, when we know that they come and they switch alliances, when we know that their motive of coming in is just for operational, for material gains. And this does not in any way insinuate that African militaries are incapable. Contemporary warfare requires modern technology, some of which are not readily available to African militaries. So this is what necessitates cooperation in terms of technical assistance. So moving forward, I would want to suggest strongly that African leaders should be shielded from, should not be exposed to the fangs of these private military companies who don't really mean well for Africa. And this can be done by foreign governments dealing with African leaders based on mutual trust and understanding. This will help balance the anti-West narratives, which is making African leaders skeptical about foreign support. I would like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Right, we've got two more. So, Mike, maybe you can now give us your views.
Very well. Thank you, Dr. Chris. So happy to be here today, and I really appreciate the invitation from the Africa Leadership Center. I think the starting point should be to ask, why are these companies being employed by African states? Dr. Onwadulu, I'm going to take up from where Dr. Onwadulu stopped, where he talked about the fact that their instability in Africa is a major reason why you find African states employing the services of these private military and security companies. Now, that is not to say that African countries or African leaders are well disposed to the operations of this organization, because as the previous speaker said, Africa is currently incapacitated militarily. And the only alternative, considering the bottlenecks that it has to go through to get the necessary security supplies, forms a major reason why Africa leans towards these organizations. Now, we're not talking about Wagner now. For example, let's take a look at their case or the engagement of STEP in 2015. Now, before STEP engaged before Nigeria engaged STEP for military support against Boko Haram, Nigeria had effortlessly tried to get support from the Western states, but to no avail. And that explains why Nigeria had to engage their STEP at the time. Now, the question then is, in this situation, does Africa really have an agency? I believe that, just as Dr. Johanna and Asala said previously, talking about African agency, I believe that the evolving scenario in Africa currently gives Africa an opportunity to exercise some form of diplomatic activism. Now, why do I say that? First, Africa does not feel threatened by the presence of Wagner, despite their accusations, despite the allegations and the propensity to destabilize Africa. However, even though Africa does not feel threatened by the presence of Wagner in Africa, I believe that we now have an opportunity, Africa now has an opportunity to present itself as capable to operate, not just operate, but even reshape the international system in which it operates in. Now, why am I saying that? Previously, Africa is considered as some politically empty space that has no capacity to act. However, one major issue that has been ongoing has been with the regulation of the private force, which I believe that the evolving scenario we have in Africa now gives Africa that opportunity to actually exercise its agency. Now, what do I mean by that? Their narrative is being to present their engagement of those organizations in Africa as some form of geopolitical remote warfare. But the question is, why present Africa as a victim? Or why present Africa as a passive entity in this operation? When Africa indeed has the capacity to act and to exercise its sovereignty. Now, if you take a look at the operations of these entities, for example, Wagner in Mali, in Libya, in Sudan, you will find that there is a common theme, and which is that it is that African states are beginning to take this as an opportunity to exercise some form of assertiveness in order to protect itself and at the same time pursue its national interest. Now, this is notwithstanding the fact that there are occasions of human rights abuses, but then the contextual details of Africa gives it that opportunity now to then take advantage of that operation or the operation of Wagner in order to present itself not anymore as a victim, but this time as an actor. And that is why you find the West is competing with the West is in a form of competition with Russia on the continent. However, Putin might think that he is fighting the West, but Africa seems to be the prophet here in this. Why? Wagner specifically, I mean, considering Africa's clientelist logic of governance, you find that African leaders interested in building some patron networks in order to enrich themselves find Wagner as that opportunity to get richer and also exercise that big man politics that is prevalent in Africa. So rather than see Africa as a victim in this, as literature presupposes, I believe that Africa right now has an opportunity to put itself forward as an important player in meaningful politics, not just recline to the state of passivity that the Western world seems to put it. Now, talking about that, for example, the question is, in what instances can Africa do this? Now, one major thing that has been talked about, or that has been an issue in the past few years, has been with the regulation of the private force. Now, what you find with the regulation of the private force is the word, every attempt to regulate the private force, even through the public-private partnership, you find the word Africa has been constantly left out of those negotiations. Africa has not been a major player in the negotiations, in the decisions that govern the regulation of industries that operate predominantly in its own territory. And that's why I believe that what we have right now, even though they are being employed to ensure stability on the continent, but I believe that this, if Africa takes this very carefully, present it with a very potent opportunity to actually represent itself in the international system, not just represent itself, but even redirect the international system in order to not just protect itself, but also contribute to the discussion or the discourse in this field. I will stop here for now.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. Very interesting. Now we have one final. Barney, please.
Thank you. I'm Barney Walsh. I'm a lecturer at the African Institute with Walsh and some others. This one's need to speak about the China. What's the China angle on all this? I'm just going to make kind of three main interrelated points here, okay? And I'll try and do it. One is that there's a history to China in Africa and the security aspect, yeah? And it actually starts with a human security story, where in the 1990s and Chinese have always been in Africa, yeah? But in the 1990s and 2000s, when steadily there's more local businesses going, there's a cultural preponderance for carrying cash. Chinese are getting robbed. Yeah, so lots of the early China local Chinese associations are actually a security, looking out for each other kind of arrangement. And as the steady but improvised increase in Chinese companies eventually leads to 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing and President Xi presenting it as this structured, well-ordered thing, but it was a lot more improvised. And a realization that Chinese citizen security was becoming an increased issue, kidnapping, theft, that kind of thing, which doesn't go down well at home, and a realization that Chinese development of security is not going to happen immediately, and that China had to do something about this. And there was a need for rules and regulations around security and private security groups, because these militias and Chinese businessmen were organizing themselves anyway, okay? And now China's presenting its China global strategy, or global initiatives. Yeah, Belt and Road, Global Development Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, and Global Security Initiative. Private security stuff will come somehow fall under. The Chinese engagement in Africa has been a lot more improvised than people think. Beijing now tries to present it as a big strategy. It's evolved. The security aspects evolved with that. Okay. Two, what's unique about Chinese private security companies or private military companies? Again, like all things Chinese, any of the bigger ones are not really private. They have strong links to the state, either just obviously, or at least if it's unofficial, they clearly have strong links to the state. There's national security aspects, if they're guarding big projects. The private-public realm is blurred or non-different, okay? There's only 20, a key thing is they can't carry guns. That's the law, they can't carry guns. But what you find is local Chinese companies partnering with local militias, the local armies, when there's more serious business like rescuing. There's 20 operating overseas. I'll say before, but there's 3 or 4 big ones that are allowed guns, and they're doing big projects, $1 billion standard in Kenya, and big mines operating in Sudan and South Sudan. Most companies are not allowed officially to carry guns, okay? But it's secretive. We don't know the full numbers. Of course, they don't want government leaking information and that kind of thing. But always, I believe there's a lot more of these companies than the official Beijing ones. Okay, I know in my own research, Hash Security, for example, in Uganda, was formed by a Chinese businessman to protect other Chinese businesses. It employs local Ugandans, by the way. It's a Chinese-run company for Chinese businesses. But that's a smaller one, yeah. That's like a Group 4 equivalent for Chinese businesses to use, yeah. And another unique feature is non-interference is real. Okay, it's shifting, it's shiftable, it's always shifted, non-interference, but it remains a distinct policy of China. China does not meddle in the way the West does in these companies, and Beijing knows the political capital it gets from non-interference, so it's very keen to avoid, doesn't want any Chinese private companies to be seen in the way Wagner is seen, or even Blackwater, the American company. It's conscious, it doesn't want rogue military companies that can be presented as Chinese starting to interfere. It's conscious of that. Yeah? Like I said, it's changed over the years from interference, but it is they behave differently to the West than do. That's not. Final point is just to say, again, it's always with Chinese characteristics, and they challenge contemporary definitions of private security. I've already said about private-public security is blurred. I've already said about how do you categorize something like Hash Security? It's owned by a Chinese company, but employs locals, and how do you categorize that? But then the big thing that is coming and has already come and is increasing is surveillance technology. Is that private security company, not in the sense we've been talking about it, CCTV cameras, China pushing or helping build safe city solutions and increasing CCTV facial recognition technology. And of course, all those conversations now have this AI component, and China's definitely increasingly supplying that kind of equipment at the request of African leaders, I should say. I haven't done the complexity of who's pushing what or who's asking for what. Plenty of African leaders want that kind of technology for their own purposes, and China's definitely supplying that. So that's it.
Okay, lovely. Right, well, we've finished the presentations. We have half an hour left for questions. Now, I'm also aware that we have 29 participants on Zoom. We're gonna start questions. So, do you want to do the Zoom bit, and then I can?
Yeah, I'll see if there's any. Yeah.
There might be. So, I found all the discussions extremely interesting myself, but this again is my subject. I spent the last quarter of a century researching private force. What I found most interesting is how it has actually developed. It's moved on since the mid to late 90s. And for those with grey hair in the room, you might remember Tim Spicer and the Sandline affair and the problems that caused, and how far this industry has actually changed and moved on and developed, but also how government's attitude towards it has changed. So I'm going to stop there. Questions for our, yes, right, okay, that's good. Right, so if you just introduce yourself and point out who you want to ask your question to, we'll just crack on that one. So yeah, we'll start there and then.
My name is Antonio Giustotti from Rusi, and I'm running a project on Wagner Group, Africa, Middle East. And one of our case studies is Mali, and we got quite a bit of information already on Mali. So I have one comment and one question. The comment is basically based on the data we get, which is interviews mostly with people in Mali, like local notable, some government people, and then people working for Wagner. I would actually agree with this sense that there is in Mali. Of course, the opinion is divided in Mali about Wagner Group, especially now. There is plenty of evidence of abuses against local communities, against local people, in specific areas where the insurgency or insurgencies are strong. But even with regard to that, opinion is divided. So people in the capital, people in the cities, people are not affected by the insurgency, think that it's a price worth paying. There was a sense that Western or French counterinsurgency was too soft, that would never resolve the issue, that would last for 30, 40 years. Then you had the suspicion that the excuse to basically stay in the country forever. We found that a very important issue was the attitude in general of the West, but especially the French, toward the Tuaregs, toward the movements in the north. Not only the fact that there was this deal sponsored by the French, Algerians, and others, but also the fact the French were recently patrolling with groups, patrolling parts of Mali. I think that unnerved people in the government, in the military. I think we're at the back of this year to think of Northern Iraq, to think of Eastern Syria, to think of Kosovo, this trend in recent years of creating this kind of de facto states within states with international intervention and last forever, right? So a loss of sovereignty for this country. So I think that's something that might have actually, it's not a totally, far-fetched hypothesis that Northern Mali would be turning into something like that. And in fact, one of the biggest achievements of Barney Group for the elite, the ruling elite in Mali, is the fact they went back into the north, right? So they went on the offensive, and basically that allowed the government to cancel the Algiers agreement with the Tuaregs. So I think different perception, a sense that what we want is more decisive counterinsurgency. If it causes some human pain, is acceptable. We need to get out of this, not in 30 years, but more in the short term. And then one thing, I'm coming to my question, one thing that was mentioned, about the dynamics that brought Wagner into Mali. People in government say that Algeria actually played an important role in this. Was Algeria a driver initially? Algeria, of course, see Mali through the prism of Libya and through the prism of French attempts to continue influencing, not very successfully, events in the region, including in Libya, right? So they're still quite pissed off with what's happening in Libya. And of course, there are a lot of things that the French do and happen very publicized in the media, but they've been doing things, including unacknowledged air raids, this kind of intervention that I think keeps irritating the Algerian authorities. There is this kind of friendliness between Algeria and France. And so the sense was, they wanted the Russians in to counterbalance the French, essentially, on the one hand. And the Russians were not particularly interested. That's how Wagner came into the picture, because Wagner was interested for their own reasons, and the Russians thought that was a way of doing things without spending their own money, without getting involved, etc. And that also one other important point that is linked to this, the Malians, and in this you can blame them, they see the need, having also operated alongside Western military forces, they see the need for an air force, because the way the Western do counterinsurgency, which maybe is not even right, but the way they do it is very heavy reliance on air power, airlift, helicopters, planes. And what thing that Wagner brought in is an air force. Of course, it's a rented air force, it's not a Malian air force. But I understand that now there are conversations between the Mali government and Russia to develop a Malian air force in the mid and long term. So my question is about Algeria, whether you see this whole Algeria regime. If you don't understand, the Algerians are not so happy about the role that Wagner is playing in undermining the agreements on the north.
Is it for me, yeah?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, great.
Just for the panelists, it's about Algeria and whether Algeria is happy with Wagner in Mali in this respect.
Yeah.
But as a Sala is from
Algeria. A difficult question for Algerian to answer, actually. Before delving into that, I want to highlight, like you mentioned about the tribes, the Tebu and the Tuareg, especially in the Mali and the Sahara, all across the Sahara. One of the uniqueness of the activities of Russian PMCs in Libya, especially, is that they, like Tuareg and Tebu, have been in long, conflicts internally with the government, especially in terms of citizenship and land rights. And when Wagner came, those tribes started working together. So just to see like how PMCs are getting involved. Now, when we're talking about Algeria, Algeria has a very unique stance when it comes to Mali. From one side, it tries to maintain, the safety of the borders. With Algeria shares borders with Libya, Niger, and Mali, and only these, the borders especially are, Algeria spends like billions just trying to maintain, its national border safety. The problem is with Russia, Algeria cannot intervene directly when it comes to Wagner, because there is no doubt that Algeria is familiar with what's happening. There are also even allegations about that Algeria was aware with the troops coming to Mali, they came from Algeria, Russian troops. But the problem is Algeria has long-standing, strong relationships with Russia. And any direct confrontation with Wagner or Africa Corps, as they are representative of the states, the Kremlin's interest might put their relationship in jeopardy. But Algeria also is having efforts, strong efforts, to maintain the stability of this region, because there are many projects standing. For example, the Trans-Saharan pipeline that Wagner put in jeopardy when starting to intervene in Niger. And so Algeria right now is trying to maintain, a certain kind of non-interference, but at the same time keeping an eye of everything. My personal opinion, I think it is time for Algeria to interfere in the situation, as it holds enough power to contribute to the stability of the Sahel region and the Libyan borders as well.
Okay, right. We're going to go then.
If I could add just one point.
Yes. Oh, certainly, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I also want to add that Algeria's fears about the operations of Wagner in Mali is also predicated upon how Wagner is undertaking its operation. Basically, they are not seeking to defeat the terrorists in Mali. They are seeking to push the terrorists away to neighboring countries. And that's why Algeria, Niger, Chad, and other neighboring countries are really scared. There has been a series of threat analysis that have taken place about Wagner's operation. They are seeking to push these terrorists, and they are seeking to cause humanitarian crisis because of the series of abuses that's going on. And the neighboring countries are scared because if all this happens, they will bear the brunt. Thank you very much.
Okay. Joanna, you've got your hand up as well.
Well, yes, to say two things to add to the question of Antonio. with whom I'm working with on the Wagner project. But on Algeria, let's remember that Algeria refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, trying to leverage a political bargain in the region. So it has also to do with how and Wagner, I think it was a game changer in terms of how these companies and how these organizations are also a policy and a political tool. We are no longer talking about the market only or the market for security, because it's not about security only. And let me just add one question that I was listening here today and on the presentation by DCAF, and the last slide of the director of DCAF basically mentioned that the fact that these companies were resorting more and more, these countries were resorting more and more to these companies was due to a loss of public control. But I totally disagree. I had to leave the room to join our group, but I totally disagree with this. I don't think it has to do with loss of public control. On the contrary, and here I agree with Mike, it has also to do with the power of making a choice. It's a choice of these countries to liaise not only with the companies themselves, but also with Russia. And let me remind you that yesterday, I don't know if you saw it or if you followed it, DRC signed a pre-agreement with the Russian government to approve military cooperation to provide support on the organization of joint drills, exercises, invitation of relevant Russian agencies to the country. I'm talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo, visit of warships and warplanes, and also training of the military and other forms of cooperation. And I think it's extremely important to try to look at this also as a long strategy and geopolitical game. In the case of Algeria, this has also to do with a unique opportunity that was open to free themselves from the connections with France and to really have a say on the maneuver of power and intervention, and in this particular case of diplomacy intervention in the Sahel. So I think Algeria, yes, I agree, plays a huge role, but this was taken as a dual weapon, not only to face and to get rid of French influence for good, and also to become a preeminent player in the region. So it has to do more than the market for security itself, and it's more than just a proxy tool. We are talking about a dynamic that wants for, obviously, to intervene in these countries and to get gains, either through resources or or power, but also in terms of influence. This has also to do with Russian interest to undermine.
Can you sum up? The only reason is
to undermine European presence and Western presence in these countries.
You can do that with former students, by the way. You can interject, you know. Thanks very much. But we've got a question in the room, then we've got two questions from participants online. So if we go with the question in the room first, then the panelists make their answers brief and short and succinct.
Well, I'll have a short question. Ewan Grant, United Kingdom Defence Forum, former intelligence analyst covering the ex-Soviet states. 8 hours in the studios, TV studios, on the afternoon of the Wagner mutiny, and I've been covering Wagnerism for 26 years. since Russia established a Air Force base in Ostend in Belgium. That's why I'm on the back cover of this book, 2022 edition, story not over. My question is, there's been no mention of two eunuchs, so I'm very grateful for not humiliating eunuchs. One is the UN, the other is the EU. Who is listening to African countries about what has to be done to change their approach in relation to the new situations that you have all, and particularly the General, regarding Algerian displacement, and above all, the bombshell from Joanna just now about DRC. Who is getting their finger out and paying attention? And follow the Antonovs, follow the helicopters, and although people will have to hold their noses, they're going to have to speak to the raiders, because that's a very powerful influence in Africa still, and if it's chucked out, we all know who will pull the gap. Thank you.
Okay, which panelists would like to answer what's happening about the EU and the UN regarding, right, hang on, Joanna, let's...
They get very, very uneasy when the subject is raised. You can see the uneasiness of the reticence to discuss this matter, because
Yes.
they don't understand.
I mean, I can reflect in part of the reality. One of the things that have happened in the last 20 years is the reality of strategic miscalculation by the West in relation to Africa, in relation to even the emergence of new mid-power countries. I mean, you don't even want to call them mid-power because some of them are actually no power, but the ability to project influence overseas. You look at the Gulf states, their own security, so they are heavily dependent on others for their own security. But what they have been able to demonstrate in the last decade is the ability to project power overseas for some very weird reason. So there has been a huge strategic miscalculation, and it first started in relation to China. But also what we are seeing now is that this miscalculation goes deeper than China. And I think there is a logic in terms of how the West saw, or see the world, even before COVID, but COVID has accelerated, that, miscalculation, a lot more. I think something happened. There was, on the back of the wave of democratization in the 1990s, coming into the 2000s, there was an expectation that with the spread of democracy in Africa, there was going to be limited wars, reduced wars. And statistically, we look at Ikpe and all the data. For 2 or 3 years, there was a drop in the number of conflicts and insecurity in Africa. There was a drop. Then it spiked again. And I think the West have not readily responded to it. Part of the lack of response and that miscalculation is the spread of right-wing conservatism in the politics of many Western countries. In this country, across Europe, in America as well, over the last 10 to 15 years, the spread of right-wing nationalism, issues of immigration and all of that have meant that many Western countries who control the EU, who control the United Nations, of course, took their eyes off the ball. And in that process, new actors came on the scene, and the West is yet to actually, accelerate, respond appropriately. When America was going to respond to this, it responded with, what is it called? The base that they set up in Africa. Yes, they responded with Africa. Again, suggesting a very wrong interpretation of what the continent requires or where the security dynamics of Africa was going. And now what you are seeing is all manner of new actors have penetrated and continue to penetrate the continent. But the reality is the nature of the warfare that relies, many of the warfare are irregular warfare that relies on, new set of equipment, that relies on force, mobility, force enablers. that are critically needed for African countries to respond to the conflict. The West, like the General Delegates said, are for all manner of bureaucracies and reasons and issues of human rights and everything. Yeah, they are unable to respond in the time required for this. And African countries have to, and governments have to look for alternatives. And I mean, the general has spoken, and I know he didn't say it, but I know Nigeria's frustration in relation to Boko Haram. The Boko Haram conflict festered in Nigeria because of the inability of Nigeria to get access to the kind of force enablers the Nigerian military needed to respond to Boko Haram. And it was not until China, Turkey, and all of these others came into the scene that America began to change, to begin to provide assistance to Nigeria. By which time, Nigeria was, able to diversify its sources of weapons. I mean, finally, back to the real question. I think the UN is clinging on to this, to the very last bit of this straw of relevance. The UN is.
You said that.
The whole world has changed. The post-World War II settlement, the post-World War II international security arrangement that sustained the world for over 50 years, as I believe that the UN failed to change, or they failed to change the UN to respond to new realities 20 years ago. They missed it with Rwanda, they missed it with Somalia, they missed it with, a lot of the new conflicts that even with former war in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia. That was a moment for the UN to evolve a new UN to respond to new security challenges. And the UN has not been able to, appropriately, respond to, till then. So what you now have is first started with regional institutions, Africa, African Union, ECOWAS, stepping into the shoes or the positions of spaces where the UN ought to have been. And what you are seeing is a continual, evolution of that, process that is ongoing. The EU, I don't want to talk about the EU, that's a separate conversation.
Yes, indeed, with the heroes.
Right, I'll tell you what we're going to do. Can we have the questions up? So I'm just going to open the floor up to the panelists. Those questions, and then right. So Ulrich question.
Magna again. So why is it rebranding as Africa Core, and does that have any implication? And then the other one was, some people mentioned they don't always operate in the same fashion in different countries. Different leaders ask for different things, different services. Just a bit more clarity and discussion.
Okay. Yeah. So we've just got over 5 minutes. Mike, you had your hand up. What I suggest we do is the panelists finish with a summary. 2 minutes, please, because I don't know what happens at 12:30 on this building, whether they send the security guards around and kick us out, or whether
got the coffee.
Well, you can have some on the way, or whether we get forgotten about and can carry on. But Mike, you had your hands up. Do you want to? You've got the EU question and the UN question as well. So the floor is yours for a minute.
That's correct. Thank you, Dr. Craze. First, with respect to the question on what exactly is the UN or the EU doing in this, I believe that first, we have a divergence of objectives here at play. First, the first question we should ask is, what exactly is their interest that the EU and the UN has in Africa in order to regulate the use of those entities? First, we might all agree that there is a divergence of interest here in the sense of word. The preoccupation of the UN and the EU in Africa is to ensure the implementation of democratic norms, and that does not respond to the reality in Africa. What Africa really wants or really desires is to secure its stability, and that does not seem to be the pursuit of the Western world. Rather, what it appears to Africans is that every initiative, every attempt by the Western world, and we're talking about the Western world, predominantly we're talking about a coalition, the EU and the UN, is that every interest in Africa is only to secure Western interests. And that is exactly why Africa has challenges or has developed the distrust for every security sector reform that has come from the Western world. And that is exactly why the efforts of the EU might be quite ineffective in this, because Africans or African states rather see their engagement of these entities as the most effective solution to solve African problems the African way. So based on that, there will be very little if Africans, and that goes back to the very purpose of this roundtable is whether Africa really has an agency. And I think that if our interests should converge, that is stability and enforcement of democratic norms in Africa, Africa would have to be recognized in this picture or in this scenario in order to ensure that there will really be an effective resolution. So here, basically, I believe that the EU's effort will be quite ineffective because there is a divergence of interest. There's a divergence of goals. And that is exactly why I believe that the US Algeria coalition might not work. Because going back to that, I mean, the Algeria has a long-standing relationship with Russia. And like Dr. Joanna rightly said earlier, we could all see the responses of the 27 African states towards the resolution, the UN resolution towards condemning Russia. I mean, the fact speaks for itself. So based on that, I'm also very skeptical about whatever would happen with the US coalition with Algeria on the same ground, because if you take a critical look at that as well, you will realize the US interest is also all about enforcing democratic norms. So the problem is Algeria is much more interested based on its antecedents on ensuring stability. So even if there is a successful coalition, we're still going to have problems with post-conflict resolution or post-reconstructions. So I believe strongly that without an effective engagement of the African continent, we might just be playing to the gallery. I'll stop here.
General, do you want to any final words on the questions? Don't worry if not. Right. Özlem, you want any final words?
Yes, actually. So he didn't expect me to say yes. No, I'll just end up by saying that, this situation really represents a dichotomy for African leaders. And it should not be, as we mentioned before, it should not solely be seen as like within very, very unreflexive adaptation of the victimization terminology or narrative by the West, or simply because African states want to be more assertive, and reclaim their agency even through Russian PMCs. It is really a very, a multi-layered, as you mentioned before, a multi-layered issue that should be, a multi-layered issues that should be focused on more. Thank you.
I just had a quick question. So with the shifting of partnerships away from the West, how does that work for military exercises that are that are currently being held, like African Lion? I mean, that's a traditional annual exercise. So how does that affect? Does the shifting of alliances or partnerships, for that matter, does it affect these exercises?
I mean, I can quickly respond to that. Two things. One, I think this is part of the the challenge. Wrong description for the problem. Those training exercises, they've been doing them for nearly 20 years. Akri, Akota, DMAT, and all of that. They've been doing them for how many years now? Close to 20 years. That is not what is required for the kind of challenges that Africa faces. You provide training, typically the trainings are about a week or two. That cannot make a difference in those environments. And the kinds of, many of the countries are dealing with, guerrilla warfare, jihadi, violent jihadists, that requires new set of, capabilities, force enablers, high-level intelligence gathering, much more precision-related weapon systems, and even heavy weaponry, in certain instances. Those trainings that you are talking about are still about traditional peacekeeping, or even when they are about counterterrorism, they are light counterterrorism that are still focused on troop movement and positioning and all of that. That is not the kinds of things that are required for. So African countries have gone to places that offers what they feel is required. I mean, look at the capabilities that NATO countries took to Afghanistan. Do African countries have access to those capabilities? So that is the key. So African countries are trying to get those same capabilities from other sources other than the West. And until the West begin to recalibrate their approach to security issues in Africa, right? And the idea is that even if you are still going to the airspace and putting boots on the ground, there are other ways of doing this. The way I see this progressing is that Wagner is going to start recruiting, and if they have not started recruiting young Africans, and even taking some of them to go and fight in Russia and in Ukraine. So you are going to have, the Africanization of Wagner, because the population is there, the young people are there, that they will easily, and Russia has done a lot, Wagner has done a lot in terms of this information, disinformation campaign, in projecting Russia as a benign, actor to Africa. So that is where that is going to go. And the bigger challenge for me is not in relation to those bilateral trainings provided by UK, France, and the US, but what would these private security actors mean for collective security systems in Africa? What does it mean for Africa's own capacity to manage its own problems and challenges? These are short-term fixes that compromise long-term capacity development.
Yeah, I'd have to, just a quick comment, I'd have to agree with you, and that's ultimately why I quit working for the DoD, because every time I would bring up the subject of African security while I was stationed in Germany, yeah, they would just completely ignore me, and I got tired of crying wolf, basically.
I mean, and we'll finish on, I have one comment to make, and one of the most notorious, although I'm not sure the word notorious is probably a good word to apply to even Barlow, who ran Executive Outcomes. And Barlow, over the last 25 years, has made it very clear that the military training that African militaries get from the West is wrong. That, they don't need NATO doctrine. What they need is training for their specific environment, and it's exactly what is actually said here. The West needs to change their attitude towards military training. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know. I suspect myself, coming from a defense academy and having taught military officers from all over the world for the last 18 years, that actually what the West is doing is benefiting from from Africa's space. It's doing training out there for its own purpose, and it's disguising that in the sense that, well, we're doing Africa a favor here by, well, no, what you're really doing here is you're doing your own training because they've got large open spaces, which we don't have, and that's my opinion.
Sorry, I wasn't going to say anything, but once you said, sorry, I'm Salim Mizudam from the ALC. What you just said, what we forget usually is that most of the Western training, military and otherwise, is geared to protect the interests of the Europeans and whatever. That does not apply only for military training. It was the same for the borders. And
Amen to that.
you heard me say that once or twice. No, I remember I was with the European Mission Against Terrorism in Sahel a few years ago, and I went to Frontex in Warsaw, and what they were talking about is basically protecting the European sphere from Africa, and the training. And I had to I've made enemies there, obviously. The training, I said, well, you already have Fortress Europe. Now you want to have Fortress Africa. Even the ECOWAS, all financial and border things, whatever, was being destroyed by the policies of Frontex because they wanted to protect the borders in order to stop the immigration towards Europe. No one cared about the interests of Africa. Sorry, I'm going.
No, that's fine. We have to leave it at that. I would like to thank, by the way, the panelists. Really very, very, very interesting discussions from them. I have actually learned an awful lot. Those on the webinar, thank you very much. I very much appreciate it, and I very much appreciate my colleagues coming in. As I say, when I set this up in January, I wasn't too sure where it was going. I actually think it's been very successful. Fortunately, not 40 people didn't turn up. We managed to get them into this room in the end, but there was 40 on this. But I hope you got something out of this. If you wish to carry on the conversation, then please do. And if you need to be in touch with any of then you can come through myself, Dr. Kinsey. I'm at King's in the Defence Studies Department, and I can put you in touch with my colleagues in this respect. But thanks a lot. You've been really good audience. And that's it. Fortunately, we have been.